Hi guy, welcome back TV spoilers. Jack had once believed the most dangerous kind of power wasn't what a person owned, but what a person could make others fear losing. For years, he built Abbott like a fortress disciplined, self-directed, and unwilling to bow to any other dynasty in Genoa City. But Victor never accepted that. To Victor, everything had a price, everyone had a pressure point, and every empire eventually fell into his orbit or got crushed beneath it. Jack had lived with that Cold War for so long he could almost predict its rhythm. The subtle interference, the quiet attempts to steer his company, the invisible hand reaching for control. What Jack wasn't used to was the sense that this time they were stepping across a thin, perilous line where one decision could either make Abbott the force that struck first, or the family branded for choosing the wrong kind of defense. So when Kyle proposed having people monitor the entire Newman family, Jack didn't just see his son's boldness. He saw years of restrained anger searching for a place to ignite. As if Kyle no longer wanted to survive by reacting. Kyle wanted to prove Abbott could make Newman stagger. Jack understood the motive and he also understood the danger. Victor had never played by clean rules, but if Abbott started speaking Victor's language, Abbott could lose the very thing it always claimed to protect its integrity and control over itself. Everything shifted from calculation to reality when news of Nick's accident hit. It cut through meetings and contracts and strategies like a blade. No one in the Abbott orbit could pretend it was just a distant tragedy. Because Nick wasn't merely a Newman name. He was a symbol tied to old fault lines between two families that had never stopped bleeding. Kyle latched onto that moment like destiny handing him a crack in the wall. And then Matt was taken. There was no public spectacle, no flashing lights, no sirens echoing through town. It happened in the silence that terrifies people who know they're doing something that can't be undone. Kyle moved like someone convinced he was protecting his family and his company. But beneath that certainty was a hard, necessary cruelty an edge Genoa City had learned from watching Victor survive. Jack saw Kyle's growth and felt pride and dread at the same time. Kyle wasn't just an heir anymore. He was becoming someone willing to make decisions in the dark to create leverage. When Jack and Kyle brought Matt to the ranch, the atmosphere inside Abbott shifted as if a stone had dropped in the center of the room. The ranch was supposed to mean peace, home, a return to values untouched by power games. This time, it became a temporary holding place. A locked drawer for a weapon Jack wasn't sure he had the right to carry. He felt the contradiction rising inside him. Part of him believed Victor only understood pressure, and if Abbott wanted breathing room, Abbott had to make Victor afraid. Another part of him was terrified Abbott was starting to resemble the very thing it despised. That the stain of Victor's methods would spread onto their hands and never wash off. Jack couldn't sleep, not because he feared Victor, but because he feared the ease with which he was beginning to justify a wrong act, with reasons that sounded right. Kyle was different. Kyle paced with a restless, wound-tight energy as if he were holding a hot secret in his chest. He believed this was a rare chance to force Victor to retreat, to prove Abbott was no longer a target that could be bent at will. Kyle looked at Matt as a bargaining chip. Jack looked at Matt as a question mark, an advantage that might win them a deal, and a trap that could drag them into legal consequences, moral collapse, and endless retaliation. The Abbotts were reaching for something priceless. Not money, not stock, not a flashy contract signed for cameras. What Jack wanted, deep down, was strategic peace. Victor would back off. Pull his hands away from Abbott, stop meddling. Stop trying to contaminate the playing field so he could own it. Jack wanted Victor out of his company's air. And Jack knew there was only one way to make Victor truly consider that creed a risk Victor didn't want to carry. Matt was that risk. Jack didn't have to threaten loudly. The simple fact that Matt had vanished from Victor's immediate reach was enough to warn Victor that something serious was unfolding. But Jack also knew Victor never entered a negotiation just to give the other side what it wanted. Victor entered to measure, to set snares, to locate the weakness in Jack's argument and twist it into profit. The priceless deal Jack imagined wasn't simply an exchange. It was a gamble on trust, something both men had long since exhausted. Meanwhile, another current rose quietly on the Newman side, and Nikki's name became impossible to ignore. Nikki had lived through too many wars to believe Victor could change for long. Victor could love, he could regret, he could soften for a moment. But his instinct to control always returned like a reflex. Nikki had nearly left him once, had reached a threshold where the heart could not endure another betrayal. Her decision to come back did not mean she forgot. It meant she chose to carry the weight again for family, for habit. For whatever good memories remained that she couldn't bring herself to destroy. But because she had stood on that edge, Nikki understood the price of repetition. If Victor used the same formula again, promising peace to soothe, then breaking faith as soon as the pressure eased, Nikki would not be the woman who forgave. She would be the woman who cut the last thread holding them together. Jack knew that, and part of him saw opportunity in it. If Victor was unstable at home, he might lose leverage. Yet Jack also understood the ugliness of exploiting someone else's marriage as a weapon. If Abbott used Nikki's fracture as leverage, Abbott would become the kind of ruthless player it had always claimed to stand against. When Nikki stepped into the meeting, it felt like the room tilted into a new kind of storm. She wasn't there merely as Victor's wife. She was there as someone who knew Victor better than anyone alive, and who was exhausted by the endless theater he believed he had the right to direct. Nikki had the power to make Victor sit down and listen, to force him to recognize that this time the enemy wasn't only Jack, but the fatigue inside his own home. Jack looked at Nikki and saw a resolve that no longer carried the softness of endurance. It was the resolve of someone willing to shatter the glass before someone else knocked it from her hands. In that moment, a deal could form. Because even Victor knew when he stood to lose more than he gained. Jack could feel the shift. Victor might agree, might temporarily yield, might say what Jack needed to hear. Kyle felt it too and took it as proof his plan had worked. But the ease of that agreement made Jack wary. Victor never gave without calculating interest. And Victor always collected that interest by another route at another time, with a blow that landed before anyone could brace for it. Jack wasn't naive. He knew even if Victor promised to leave Abbott alone, that promise would last only until Victor saw a better opening. Victor might nod today to calm the crisis, to regain control, to quiet Nikki, to make Abbott believe they had won. And then tomorrow, Victor would break the deal through a quieter, harder-to-trace channel, just as vicious as before. Jack understood that mechanism, yet he was still forced to try. The situation had already tightened around them. Matt was at the ranch, and that fact turned Abbott into the one holding the knife. If Abbott didn't use that knife to force Victor to step back, the knife would cut them instead. The longer Matt remained hidden, the greater the risk. Jack stood between two fears, that Victor would keep attacking if unchecked, and that Abbott would destroy itself if it chose the wrong way to stop him. Kyle, in his taut confidence, still saw the board in simpler terms. Victor was a bully who needed to be stopped. Matt was living proof of danger. Monitoring Newman was justified because the enemy never played fair. Kyle didn't want to retreat, because retreat would mean admitting Abbott would always live in Victor's shadow. But Jack looked at Kyle and saw behind the determination a hunger to prove himself. Kyle wanted to show Jack he could protect Abbott more aggressively than the previous generation ever dared. He also wanted to prove to himself he wasn't a man who merely responded, was a man who shaped the game. Jack didn't want to extinguish that ambition. He wanted Kyle to understand that real strength wasn't doing anything you could. It was stopping before you turned into what you hated. At the same time, Nikki became a mirror for Jack's deepest worry about promises. Nikki had forgiven before, returned before, but every return had been another way of suffocating her own dignity. Another act of telling herself love and family were worth the pain. If Victor broke faith again, Nikki might not have the ability to tell herself that story anymore. That made Jack see both an opening and a tragedy. The opening was that Victor might be forced to keep his word out of fear of losing Nikki. The tragedy was that Nikki would still be asked to endure one more battlefield, just so Victor could learn a lesson he might never truly learn. Jack didn't want to be a man who helped push Nikki into another breaking point. But the chain was already locked together, the deal with Victor, the pressure of Matt, Kyle's risk, and Nikki's thinning margin for tolerance. And then the most dangerous phase of any power struggle began to reveal itself quiet before the strike. When a deal seemed possible, when Victor seemed to yield, when Abbott thought it had leverage, the air only grew heavier. Jack didn't feel relief. He felt the hollow space where Victor usually planted new strategies. Kyle began to sense the instability too, even if he refused to name it. His confidence stopped sounding like victory and started sounding like the fast heartbeat of someone afraid he'd gone too far. Nikki, even if she had briefly pulled Victor back from the edge, couldn't erase the feeling that she had just seen the truth again. Victor only paused when he feared losing something vital. But the moment the danger passed, he would return to himself. And Victor, even if he nodded today, was still a man who despised being cornered. He might be restraining himself, but restraint wasn't surrender. It was simply choosing a different way to win. Jack stood at the ranch and felt the night's cold seep through the wood, and he understood that what he called a priceless deal might be nothing more than a mask. He asked himself whether he was dragging Abbott into a war it could never win, while staying the kind of family it wanted to be. He asked whether this path would truly bring peace, or only open a spiral where Victor retaliated in a new direction. And Abbott answered with something worse, until no one recognized themselves anymore. He looked at Kyle and saw the fire still burning, but he also saw a thin line of fear like a crack in glass. Kyle wouldn't say it aloud, But Jack knew his son was wondering how far control could actually extend. Because the moment you hold someone like Matt as a card, you don't just hold their body. You hold the invisible consequences already gathering outside the door. In the end, the most frightening question wasn't whether Victor would keep his promise. It was that Jack already knew the answer. Victor could promise and Victor could betray. Nikki could endure and Nikki could collapse if forced to relive the same nightmare. Kyle could believe he was doing the right thing. But the right thing kept in darkness long enough could warp into something else. Abbott could believe it was winning. But its advantage was fragile because it depended on a secret that could never survive daylight. On the silence of people inside the house. And on the assumption that Victor feared loss more than he craved retaliation. Jack knew Victor well enough to understand that Victor didn't fear loss the way ordinary men did. Victor feared one thing above all: being controlled. And once that nerve was touched, he would do whatever it took to seize the advantage again. Even if it meant burning down the very things he'd sworn to protect. That was the hook hiding inside the stillness, the moment Jack believed he had set the terms. The moment Kyle believed they had finally checked Newman. The moment Nikki believed she had pulled Victor back from the brink was the exact moment. Victor had the most room to deliver a strike no one saw coming. And Jack began to feel, with a cold certainty, that Victor's counterattack might not hit the company first. It might go straight for the one weakness that would ensure Abbott could never raise its hand again. The air after Nikki's confrontation didn't feel like victory. It felt more like a room whose door had just been shut. After a blast of winter wind leaving everyone inside to wonder what line they had crossed. Nikki may have delivered the harshest words she had been storing for far too long. Because Matt's presence made everything painfully tangible. Like a living receipt for a chain of schemes that had dragged on past the point of reason. But when the anger began to settle, what remained wasn't satisfaction. It was a heavy question pressing down on the moment. What were they supposed to do with Matt now? And were they slowly becoming the kind of people they claimed to despise? Jack saw Nikki's fury as a warning, not only aimed at an enemy, but aimed straight at them. The closer Matt was, the more brutal the choice became. If Jack handed Matt back to Victor, he could tell himself this was the only way to end things in a proper framework. But he also knew Victor would never allow Matt to slip from his grip again. Matt would be tightened, reshaped, managed like a resource seized as a pawn to erase the humiliation of being forced into a corner. And if Jack kept Matt, he would have to consider an option he didn't even want to name. An image that kept rising like a stain, a makeshift prison, captivity disguised as control. And the sickening comparison to what Victor once did with Jordan. Jack didn't want to look in the mirror and realize he had started learning Victor's methods. But the silence of the situation pushed him toward choices he would have once rejected. Without hesitation. Even Nikki, fierce as she was, couldn't ignore the disgust that surfaced at the thought of things sliding into a surveillance and cages mentality where justice blurred into personal punishment. It just burned in glances, in pauses, in sentences cut short. As if everyone was afraid that one more word would force them to admit the truth they were trying not to touch. Somewhere else in Genoa City, Holden was caught in a different kind of dead and quieter, but no less dangerous. His closeness with Claire was becoming more visible not because of grand promises, but because of small moments that made her feel seen and heard. Yet that softness became fuel for doubt the moment Audra carefully poured another shadow over what Claire was trying to believe. Claire had lived too long with people calling peace by beautiful names and then using it like a trap. So she couldn't accept that Audra truly wanted harmony. She began to examine every detail, every coincidence, every look that lingered a beat too long. She didn't rush to a verdict, but she refused to let herself relax. Holden sensed the change like a cord tightening around his wrist. He wanted to keep whatever was growing with Claire, wanted to step into her world without suspicion clinging to him. But he couldn't control what Audra was doing or what Audra was making other people think. If Claire kept digging, what she uncovered might not be just a big secret tying Audra and Holden together. It could become the fracture that collapsed her trust in a way that couldn't be repaired. Holden was trapped between wanting to prove he was harmless and the fear that the harder he tried to prove it, the more he would look like someone hiding something. And Audra, even as the obvious agitator, kept things just ambiguous enough, as if she didn't need to win immediately. She only needed Claire to stop being certain about anyone. As night settled in, those pieces didn't lock into a clear picture. They formed a shared sensation of pressure and narrowing air. Jack understood that the priceless deal was no longer about forcing Victor to retreat on paper, but about keeping Abbott and everyone connected to it from being warped by the very thing they were fighting. Nikki understood that her toughness could be a weapon, but it could also become the blade that made people bleed more than she ever intended. Claire understood her instincts were ringing like an alarm, and she couldn't tell whether it was survival intuition or fear of betrayal. Creating enemies out of shadows. Holden understood he was standing at the edge of a cliff, where the moment one secret was called by its real name, everything could collapse. And Matt, whether he was held or handed back, remained the knot that made every option smell like danger. No one spoke a final conclusion, because any conclusion right now sounded less like a solution and more like a sentence. There was only the sense that something was still moving in the dark, and whatever decision came tomorrow might not be an ending at all. It might only be a comma pulling the story onward, into a direction even the writer wasn't ready to name. On our TV Spoilers channel, I'm always looking for content inspiration for each video by compiling short video clips to analyze and offer my personal opinions. This channel specializes in analyzing, theorizing, and discussing plot points in the Young and the Restless series from the perspective of a longtime fan. Through this, viewers can gain deeper, more objective, and more interesting insights. Subscribe to the channel to stay updated on the latest news about the Young and the Restless series.